parked his car by the dike and walked to the entrance of the main building at Camping Maastricht. He walked straight through to the entrance of Sophie's Choice, leaving the administration and fries shop behind, knowing that he would soon treat himself to a nice super with stewed meat and mayonnaise. Frank was sitting at a table with a beautiful view of the Maas, reading a newspaper. Tom sat down across from him and started laughing. "Now that's what I call a Swiss life feeling," he said, laughing, while Frank looked up from his deep trance and also began to laugh. "Yeah, you could say that. It's always nice to relax like this, and honestly, the view here is just as beautiful as from a mountaintop abroad, especially in the summer months with all those boats. But that's not why I called you. I wanted to talk to you about Suzanne's boyfriend." "You mean our Don Juan, our alter ego, the ideal son-in-law, Stephen, that one?" Tom responded, slightly surprised. "Yes, that one," said Frank. "There's nothing I can tell you," said Tom. "He seemed like a nice guy, hardworking, successful, in short, nothing new. Not my type of friend or acquaintance. He was a bit too slick for me, seemed like a foreigner, some slick Greek or Italian, a real charmer. She was crazy about him, so who am I to say anything about her boyfriend?" Tom ordered 2 coffees and continued. "I can tell you more about Suzanne, about her being followed after she left Tilburg from visiting him, about her interests and expectations." "That's enough," said Frank. "What I'm interested in is why that guy was interested in her and what his intentions were." "I might have an explanation for that," said Tom, while watching someone perform the strangest stunts on a jet ski. "About 2 years ago, she became interested in a website of a group of so-called Bosch terrorists who, according to them, humorously and with videos on the internet, made short work of the royal family, something Suzanne wasn't a fan of either, but she still saw it as a symbol of our country. She could have some respect for Willem Alexander, who seemed more human to her than his mother. I also remember that Peter Tetteru was involved with that crazy group for a while. Suzanne dropped out after the Swamp Dragons, as they called themselves in the beginning, posted a video showing a fake attack on Beatrix that looked quite disgusting. From what I understand from Suzanne, it was also a way to set up an army of patriots, an army that could be enabled to overthrow this government and establish a republic. They were selected and recruited through this site. She also told me she was approached but had turned them down by saying she wasn't interested. Was that true, or did she go along and knew too much? Maybe she was being followed. You know how she was. She could be very curious. Meanwhile, some bells were starting to ring for Frank, and he was already connecting some dots. What stood out to him was Peter's name in this story, and he couldn't shake the impression that he also had something to do with the matter. How long had he known Peter, and what role could he play in this story? If I mention the name Peter, what does that mean to you? Tom frowned. Well, a very serious, reliable guy, someone you'd follow into a fight, good speaker, good arguments. Okay, I wanted to know how you felt about him and if he could potentially have anything to do with her death. Tom looked at Frank and quietly said, I might be saying something strange now, but he seems like the type who could strangle someone without flinching or blushing. He's a cold-blooded figure and has quite an ego. Mind you, I don't think he's a bad guy. Frank wasn't surprised by Tom's comment and was also convinced that Peter was someone with quite an ego and someone who wouldn't have trouble leading a unit in the army or the police. His authoritative character made him suitable for many roles. Add a high IQ to that, and you have a potential danger when he gets room for his ideas, which might deviate from his behavior. Was Peter a person with a secret agenda? Frank didn't know and hoped that wasn't the case. Otherwise, he'd have a formidable opponent, and the danger was now very close. He thought for a moment about the photos Suzanne had taken before her fatal fall. They might yield something, he thought, and decided to get the camera, still in possession of the local police, released with the help of her family. This shouldn't be too difficult, he thought. You also mentioned a chase? Meanwhile, Sophie brought the second cup of coffee and asked if everything was to their liking. When are you playing here again? She asked Tom. Slightly surprised because he liked that she recognized him as a guitarist, he told her they would be playing here again in 2 months. Nice, said Sophie. I really enjoyed it the last time you played here." Tom thanked her for the compliment, took a sip of the still very hot coffee, and continued the conversation. Yes, that was after she visited Stephen in Tilburg on the day of the attack. She told me that he, along with another guy, had come home, and she didn't recognize him at that moment due to his rather hurried and aggressive manner. Right after, on the way back, she was rear-ended by a van that later crashed into a crossing car. She had been drinking, so she drove off and later reported that she had witnessed the accident without saying she was being followed. The police told her that everything was fine and that they would contact her if there was anything. This never happened, so she didn't think about it anymore or talk about it. She said she found it exciting. She was lucky that despite the many checks that evening, she still managed to get into the city center. Or did they know where she was going and tried to link her to me? A ridiculous idea. Me being shadowed by some secret service, ridiculous. Frank reassured him. "You don't need to worry. There's nothing they need to shadow you for. You're just a passerby and have nothing to do with this. But they will have figured that out by now, too." Frank knew that Tom had nothing to do with the whole affair. He knew him too well for that. No, the solution had to be sought with Peter and his role in this story.
Later at home, Frank turned off the TV. What a farce the news had become. It seemed like state television. The strict measures were starting to get out of hand and were becoming increasingly noticeable. The introduction of the identity card with an embedded RFID chip was his biggest concern. He hadn't heard much more about it than a few small mentions in the newspapers, overshadowed by the bigger, more important news of the attack and its aftermath, including the release of the Van der Vaart Commission report. He was beginning to see the possible dark plan that was starting to unfold. Recently, he had read a lot and delved into what many devout people referred to as the end times, the battle at Armageddon between Western and Eastern forces, the intervention by the Watchers and God, and ultimately the return of Jesus to earth. Palin, the Republican running mate of McCain, is a member of a church that believes in this end time and the accompanying rapture, the moment when God suddenly takes his true followers away to later return with them to earth. According to them, those who disappear are the chosen ones. The vast amount of information on the internet certainly paints a very different picture of American presidents and their pasts. For instance, it turns out that the majority of presidents, including Bush, Carter, and Clinton, are directly related to the English royal family. The life story of George Bush Jr.'s grandfather was also one not worth bragging about. This George Shepherd Bush worked for the American Union Bank before the war, laundering money for the Nazis. Together with Franz Thyssen, a former Nazi, steel manufacturer, and friend of Prince Bernhard, he openly supported Hitler. America had more scandals in this area. For example, the testimony of an American general in the court case following many arrests, who recounted a coup planned by the army, which would result in a National Socialist government in America, modeled after the German Nazis. It also appears from various documents that Russia and China owe their communist systems to secret American support and finances through various European-affiliated banks. The Rothschilds, Morgans, and Rockefellers were and still are the people who pull the strings behind the scenes, determining the current worldview through their secret meetings during Bilderberg gatherings. More and more people, and this became clear to Frank, had been given a different picture during their younger years of what was really happening and what was yet to come. His favorite sites, like Above Top Secret, which reported everything about UFOs and other bizarre phenomena, had since been shut down, and many videos were banned from the internet. YouTube and Google applied a filtering policy, banning videos they deemed harmful and inflammatory. The number of violent videos had increased, including those from the Next Genesis Foundation, which had now shown its 10th sacrifice. Did people not care, or were they slowly becoming immune to such images? From the reactions on the Next Genesis Foundation's site, you wouldn't think so. There were already 2 billion people worldwide who had signed the petition, including many people working in the judicial world. They were now collectively looking for a way to bring all world leaders involved in war, corruption, and fraud things that could be proven, to justice. As an individual from one country, you can't bring a leader from another country to court. You have to be a resident of the country in question and have a legitimate reason. The aim of these people, who had meanwhile united in a group called the International Lawyers, was to file a joint complaint with the Hague Court and the UN. This UN would first need to be thoroughly vetted and eventually recognized as the official government of a world without borders. Everything under one flag and with a fitting economy, with truly equal rights for every individual. The next morning, Frank went to collect the photos taken by Suzanne during her climb from Detective DeWitt, a former detective from the Gouda police force. A man with a small stature, but the deeds of a great man. He had unmasked and dismantled a gang of extremists. This criminal gang operated out of Gouda, already known for its immigrant problems. Dismantling this gang brought more peace to the region. He was transferred to s-Hertogenbosch because there were indications of a similar group there. DeWitt's approach had led to the arrest of the two perpetrators, AD and HD, in s-Hertogenbosch. Frank parked his car in the lot opposite the police station and walked to the reception desk in the strikingly modern building. The on-duty officer, whom Frank recognized as Nina Johnson, was a charming woman who had been in his class in school. Intelligent, and Frank wasn't surprised to find her here. If she recognized him, his visit was already halfway successful. She still looked great, he thought, and he briefly fantasized about making love to her, lying in the grass by a gently flowing stream. "Good morning, my name is Frank Verhofstadt, and I have an appointment with Detective Ben DeWitt," she laughed. "I know who you are. We went to school together." "Nina," she said, flashing a smile that transported him back in time, the images vivid and in color. "St. Jan Smavo. Good times. I still have fond memories of it. You work for Bosch, that program Focus on Friday. I always listen when I'm not on duty. Very informative and interesting." Frank blushed, surprised by her recognition. "Thanks for the compliment," he stammered. "Detective DeWitt is in room 13 on the first floor." Frank thanked her and walked up the stairs to the first floor. She had said to the right. He knocked on the door and opened it after hearing a confirming, "Come in." DeWitt sat behind his desk, staring at his PC. He stood up and shook Frank's hand. "Nice to meet you, Ben DeWitt. Please have a seat," he smiled, pointing to the chair in front of his tidy desk. Frank sat down. "I understand you're here for Suzanne's photos. I've reviewed them again, but found nothing that suggests foul play in this case. In my opinion, it's a tragic accident." Frank remained silent. The man had an open and honest face, naturally hardened by his profession, but with a trustworthy demeanor. His voice was resolute and unhesitant, solid. "What do you look for?" Frank asked. "I look for known figures who shouldn't be there. Besides people from the s-Hertogenbosch scene, I look for known figures from other environments. I recognize no one and see nothing strange. I just reviewed the photos on the memory stick and would like you to go through them with me to see if you recognize anyone. Can I get you a coffee?" he asked as he walked to the door. "Yes, please," said Frank. "Black, no sugar." Ben returned 2 minutes later with the coffee and sat back behind his desk. Frank moved his chair next to the detective. He immediately displayed the first photo. Frank recognized nothing or no one and said no, indicating he could scroll further. When they reached the photo taken from the rock face, he tapped Ben's arm and asked him to enlarge it. Frank was shocked. His heart skipped a beat. "Fuck him." He pointed to the stocky man in the crowd who looked a lot like Peter. Was it possible? Was Peter somehow involved, and why, he wondered. "Do you know this person?" Ben asked. "Yes, that's our program's co-host." "You mean Mr. Teteru?" "Yes, that's him," Frank said, somewhat surprised. "We know him well, very well," Ben replied. "Mr. Teteru was a member of a group called the Movavi, where he served as an informant. Teteru was recruited by the AIVD to assess the threat this group posed to national security. He did excellent work providing information that allowed us to dismantle this radical group. Behind the scenes, they were recruiting people for a patriotic struggle against the monarchy." Frank mentioned that he knew Suzanne was an ardent supporter of this group and that she had been approached by them, but declined because it was too extreme. He also recounted the story of the chase. Now we're getting somewhere. Ben became interested and started to see the case differently. "Look," he said, "I'm not a fan of a queen who is above the law, filthy rich, while her compatriots, often the less wealthy, suffer from debt. The taxes we pay, or should I call it rent, along with her many extras and her multi-million share in Royal Dutch Shell, paint a picture of a greedy, money-grabbing woman with little interest or love for her always loyal people. But involved in an assassination plot, well, then it becomes something criminal, and I'm obliged to do my job. She, too, is a citizen of this country and needs to be protected by people like us." Mr. Teteroux was even knighted by her in the Order of the Orange Nassau. Frank remembered that Peter had indeed been knighted a year ago, but this was supposed to be related to his work for the safety of Eindhoven Airport. His actions had reportedly prevented a disaster involving 2 Boeing 747s. Frank began to see Peter in a different light and was curious about what else this dutiful detective could tell him. Suddenly, Ben's expression turned very serious. "I shouldn't actually tell you this," he said conspiratorially, "but something just came to mind. The last case that also involved Peter. It concerns his infiltration of the radical extremist group we've now come to know through the attack as the Freedom Fighters of Islam. He, in collaboration with us, managed to unmask this group and inform us of their actions and plans. The result is now known. It was a group of extremists led by a nephew of Osama bin Laden and a certain Imam Grossfeld."
The AIVD had been tracking this group and was fully aware of their plans. Peter's role in all of this wasn't entirely clear, because various interests often overlap when you're working undercover. He provided us with crucial information about the place where they carried out their activities under the guise of a sports club. He also explained the role of the Imam. This was a former welfare recipient. He had received welfare benefits after working in construction for 3 months and ending up on disability due to an accident. Additionally, he had a leadership role as a hooligan among the supporters of the English football club Chelsea. He was known for his largely right-wing sympathies, so it was a huge turnaround when he suddenly converted to Islam. A freeloader who, after his revelation, started preaching in a mosque in Tilburg. The board, unaware of his background, welcomed him as the prodigal son, a convert. Grossfeld has since disappeared without a trace. Ben continued scrolling, and both saw nothing more on the footage that could be related to Suzanne's fatal fall that day. Then he mentioned that there were also some photos in the internal memory. The images they had been viewing so far came from a memory stick. He opened another folder and started clicking through the photos using the viewer. Suddenly, he stopped at a photo of a stall and zoomed in on a man calmly eating a hot dog. "Well, I'll be damned, sorry for the comment," quickly adding, "Imam Grossfeld, in the flesh. What is he doing there?" Frank was now completely intrigued. What do these people have to do with each other, and why are they in that place specifically? Both stared at the screen, their brains working overtime. Did Suzanne have something to do with the attack as well? Could there be a connection between Peter and the Imam? Frank asked Ben if it was possible that these two knew each other. Perhaps both were members of the AIVD? Were they there with sinister intentions, in this case, Suzanne's death? And if so, what was the motive? Ben thought for a moment and then said, "According to our information, nothing else is known about the Imam besides what I just told you. However, I did know that Peter Teteroux worked for the AIVD because I regularly consulted with him during the Swamp Dragon case, and by conducting our own investigations separately, we didn't want to interfere with each other. Of course, we don't know who else was involved in this case, because these are undercover agents who obviously prefer to remain anonymous, even to colleagues. I can, of course, discreetly gather some information from other corps and say that Teteroux is being sought for a hit-and-run accident he might be involved in." "Why were you late and unable to prevent the attack?" Frank asked, taking his last sip of coffee. "Well, at the time of the arrest of AD and HD, we were informed by higher authorities that the case would now be handled by them, and they were satisfied with the outcome," Ben said, with an extremely serious expression. As it turns out, someone must have been asleep at the wheel, and they apparently didn't realize that the plans for execution were much further along.
I'll let you know as soon as possible, Ben said. Leave your mobile number, and I'll call you within a few days. I'm convinced I can clarify several aspects of this history.
Frank noted down his number and said goodbye to Ben. He found Ben to be a sympathetic guy with a good perspective on this shady case. He hoped that Ben was the right man for the job and that some news would come soon. Frank walked downstairs, greeted Nina kindly, and mentioned he hoped there would be a reunion soon. It seemed like a fun idea. She wished him success with his program and continued with her work. Meanwhile, Roland had developed a relationship with Wendy after calling her one evening following their first meeting to ask if she wanted to have a drink with him. Somehow, she didn't sound surprised, as if she had expected his call. The two had been almost inseparable since then and were head over heels in love. Wendy, who was still living with her mother, moved in with Roland after 2 months and claimed to be in seventh heaven. She said Roland was a guy with a big heart, but also a real man who, besides a dose of masculinity, didn't have too many hormones to also show his emotions, his more feminine side. In short, he was her hero. Roland, satisfied with a more regular life and a bit tired of his bachelor status, expressed being extremely happy with his new flame. He called her a real firecracker, someone who wasn't shy about sex and full of fantasies, like that evening when he came home quite late and hadn't had a chance to eat. He had called Wendy and told her he'd be home later and that he had missed dinner. "I'll arrange something for you when you get home," was her response. When he put his key in the lock at 8 p.m. that night, hung up his coat, and walked straight to the living room to sit in his favorite chair, the kitchen door opened. Roland, who was always up for something tasty, was momentarily unsure whether he was actually hungry or in the mood. Subconsciously, he had already made the choice and began to realize it. His hormones kicked in, and while a delicious plate of mashed kale was steaming on the tray, Wendy set it on the table and said, "Does my master have enough, or are there other desires?" She then took the smoked sausage, slowly brought it to her mouth, and started teasing it softly with her tongue. As she bent over, he gazed at her beautifully shaped body. His mouth watered at the sight of all this deliciousness. According to Roland, this was the tastiest plate of mashed kale he had ever eaten. He would often think back to this moment with future plates of mashed kale. Tonight they were going out.